A stranger's hand closes on Bruce Lee's shoulder before the studio audience even understands what they're watching. Not a producer's hand, not a friend's, reaching to steady him or wave him toward a chair. A hand that outweighs the arm it's attached to, fingers spread wide enough to nearly span the width of Bruce's shoulder, and it does not tap. It grips. The camera operator catches the motion half a second late, and the frame lurches hard right, nearly a foot, and for one full second the shot is nothing but ceiling light and the ragged edge of a curtain. Then the sound goes. Not fades, cuts, mid-syllable. A live studio floor, about 400 people in folding chairs under hot lights, and the audio drops to a flat, dead silence that every one of those people will describe differently for the rest of their lives, and none of them will quite agree. A few seconds later, somewhere behind a wall of dials, a network engineer does the only thing his training tells him to do when a live broadcast comes apart in front of a paying public. He punches to commercial. You want to know how a man ends up with a stranger's hand on his shoulder, live, in front of a studio audience and a home audience nobody ever managed to count? So do I. That's the whole reason I'm telling this one. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos. The one that refuses to die. The one that's outlived every studio hand who swore they'd never repeat it. Los Angeles. A network soundstage built for variety and talk, the kind with a live band tucked in the corner and a floor manager who counts the room in on his fingers. 1971. Bruce Lee is 30 years old. A name martial artists already know, a name television barely knows yet. And on this particular Tuesday night, he is not the headline. He is the color, the demonstration, the guest who gets 6 minutes to make the real star of the evening look good. The real star of the evening is a movie actor whose name is already 20 feet tall outside 4 theaters downtown. A leading man built for close-ups, not for what's about to happen to him. And standing about 8 feet behind that actor's left shoulder the entire night is a big man in a dark suit who hasn't said a word to anyone. That's the fourth piece, and I like to lay these out early. Time. A Tuesday night in 1971. Place. A network soundstage in Los Angeles built for exactly this kind of live, unscripted television. The identifying detail, a man built like a doorway, suit is sized too tight through the shoulders, standing exactly where bodyguards stand, close enough to matter, far enough to be forgotten. And the result, the one thing every version of this story agrees on, 40 seconds of that broadcast do not exist anymore. Not misfiled. Not sitting in some studio basement waiting to be found. Not lost in an archive somewhere. Gone. Nobody has ever produced them. Now, did I see that tape? No. Nobody I've ever talked to has seen that tape. I want to be straight about that before we go one line further, because we're going to spend the next hour and a half circling those 40 seconds, and I'd rather you trusted me going in than caught me out later. But stay with me, because the story of how those 40 seconds vanished turns out to be a better story than whatever was actually on them. And I think by the end, the not knowing turns out to be the whole point. Let me take you back to what led up to that hand. 40 seconds. That's the whole story, really, or at least that's where the story insists on starting. So let's slow it down, because the legend doesn't get interesting until it's taken frame by frame. The bit itself was never meant to be dangerous. The host had set it up as a lark. The movie star, a good sport, always was, volunteers himself as Bruce's demonstration partner for a self-defense in 30-second segment, the kind of harmless novelty that fills 6 minutes between a car commercial and a band nobody remembers. Bruce steps in close. The setup is casual, almost comic. The star throws a slow, telegraph grab at Bruce's lapel, the kind of grab that exists only on television, the kind no one would ever actually throw. Bruce doesn't wait for the joke to land the way it was blocked to land. His hand meets the star's wrist before the wrist finishes its arc. Not a slap, Not a flinch, a clean interception, the kind of thing that takes about 18 inches of total travel and a tenth of a second of decision. The biomechanics of it are almost insultingly simple once they're laid out plainly. Bruce isn't reacting to the strike. He's reacting to the intention behind it, moving on the first millimeter of shoulder rotation instead of waiting for the fist. That's the gap nobody in the audience can see and everybody in the room can feel. The star's arm folds a half-turn past where it wants to go. He staggers half a step, catches himself, laughs, a genuine laugh. The audience laughs with him. For about 2 seconds, this is exactly the harmless bit it was written to be. And that's when the big man in the dark suit takes his first step out of the shadow behind the cameras. Nobody in the audience clocks it as anything yet. Witnesses who were there, and there were, depending which version gets told, somewhere between 3 and 11 people close enough to the stage lights to see his face, say he didn't look angry. He looked like a man executing an instruction he'd rehearsed and didn't especially want to carry out. That's the myth doing its work already, by the way. That detail, rehearsed and didn't want to, is exactly the kind of thing that gets added the 4th or 5th time a story gets told, not the first. I can't promise it's true. I can promise it's the detail that survives every retelling. And I've learned to pay attention to the details that survive. Here's what led to this moment, and it starts 3 months earlier in a much smaller room with much worse lighting. Bruce Lee, in the spring of 1971, is a man doing arithmetic on his own career, and the arithmetic is not encouraging. A television pilot he had built with his own hands and his own voice. A modern Western, a role written around exactly what he could do that no one else on a soundstage could do. Had gone quiet in the way projects go quiet when a studio decides, without ever quite saying so out loud, that the lead should look like someone else. Nobody sends a letter. Nobody says the word. The meetings just stop being scheduled, and eventually a man stops asking, because asking has a cost too. So when a booker for a live network variety hour calls Bruce's manager and offers 6 minutes on a Tuesday night, a favor, a friend, 6 minutes to demonstrate something sharp and photogenic next to a genuine box office name, Bruce says yes before his manager finishes the sentence. 6 minutes of network airtime in 1971 in front of the only kind of audience that studios actually count is not a small thing to a man who has just watched a show built around him get quietly handed to somebody else. It is, in fact, close to the only kind of proof he has left that the audience wants him specifically and not just the idea of him. That's the fear sitting under every second of what's about to happen on that stage. Not vanity, leverage, or the total absence of it. The afternoon before the broadcast, there's a rehearsal, and rehearsals are where everyone learns who's actually nervous about a live show, because nerves show up as questions asked 3 times. The movie star isn't nervous. By every account, that survives. And there are more of these than you'd expect, because a man that famous walking through a rehearsal hall gets remembered by everyone who saw him. He's warm, easy, the kind of star who learns the crew's names by the second day of a shoot and means it when he uses them. He likes Bruce immediately, says so, out loud, to more than one person, watches Bruce move through the blocking once, quietly, and says something to the effect of, "Well, I'm glad I'm not really trying to hit him." His manager does not share the sentiment. The manager is a compact man in a gray suit who has built an entire career on the principle that his client's face is worth more than anything his client might say or do, and he has never once, in 15 years, let anyone else forget it. He watches the blocked bit, the slow, harmless telegraph grab, the interception, the stumble, the laugh, and he does not laugh. He asks the segment producer twice whether the reaction could be softened, whether the star could be shown, in his word, winning some smaller piece of the exchange. He is told both times that it's a 30-second novelty bit and nobody is going to be watching that closely. He does not look reassured. And here's a detail almost every version of the story keeps, for whatever that's worth. He spends most of that rehearsal standing exactly where his client's bodyguard will stand the following night, 8 feet back, stage left, close enough to see everything, far enough to be scenery. Now, the version I've heard from 3 separate corners of the martial arts world doesn't call it a rehearsal note. It calls an instruction. I don't know that. Nobody who wasn't in that room knows that. What I do know is that by the time the actual broadcast rolled, the man standing 8 feet behind the star's shoulder was watching one thing all night, and it wasn't the band. So, Tuesday night, same room, hotter lights, for 100 people instead of 9. The bit runs exactly like it ran in rehearsal, right up until it doesn't. Bruce steps in close. The star throws his slow telegraph grab. Bruce's hand meets the wrist before the wrist finishes its arc. The star folds a half-turn past where his balance wants to let him go, stumbles, laughs. And here's the part rehearsal didn't have. The audience's laugh is a half beat too big. It's not cruel, not exactly, but it's the kind of laugh a room gives when it's just quietly decided who the more dangerous man in the room is. And it isn't the one whose name is on the marquee outside. 2 seconds. That's all it takes for a room to reach that kind of consensus, and everybody on that stage feels the room reach it at the same moment. The star's own face doesn't change much. By every account, he takes it well. He's laughing along with the room. He says something warm and self-deprecating into his lapel mic that gets its own laugh. He is, by every account that exists, entirely fine with what just happened to him on live television. His manager is not fine with it. Look at it from the edge of that stage for a second, because that's the only angle that actually explains what happens next. 8 feet back, stage left, a compact man in a gray suit watches 400 strangers laugh at the exact moment he spent an entire rehearsal trying to prevent, and somewhere in the 3 seconds after that laugh lands, he does something. Nobody agrees on exactly what. A nod, a step forward. One version I've heard secondhand from a man who says his father ran cable on that stage for 11 years. Says he simply looked at the bodyguard and didn't look away the way a handler holds eye contact with a dog trained to a single command. I can't verify a single word of that. I want to say that plainly because we're about to watch a very large man cross a television soundstage on the strength of a look nobody can prove was ever given, and that ought to raise an eyebrow. It raises mine. Stay with me anyway. Because whatever the signal was, the bodyguard moves. Not fast. That's the strange part every witness agrees on. The part that doesn't read like an accident or a loss of control. He crosses 8 feet of soundstage floor at something close to a normal walking pace. The pace of a man delivering a message, not a man losing his temper. He is close enough this whole time to have been standing there for the star's protection. He was never, according to anyone who's ever laid out this story for me, hired to protect anyone for Bruce Lee. That's the piece that changes the entire shape of the legend, and it's worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't a bodyguard's instinct kicking in against a threat. Bruce never raised a hand to the star that hadn't been scripted, rehearsed, and laughed off warmly by the very man it happened to. Whatever this was, it wasn't protection. It was a correction. So walk through it the way the legend walks through it, one motion at a time, because this is the part that actually earns its place in the back rooms of old dojos. Set up. Bruce is 3/4 turned toward the host's desk, mid-sentence, delivering the kind of easy, charming line that closes out a bit like this one. His weight is settled. His hands are open and low, because as far as he knows, the demonstration is over, and what's left is just talk. He is, in the one way that actually matters here, not braced for anything. Technique. The hand lands on the meat of his shoulder from behind and slightly to the side, and it doesn't rest there. It closes and pulls, the specific grip a much larger man uses when he wants to turn somebody around bodily rather than simply get their attention. Biomechanics. And this is the detail that makes the whole thing land differently once it's understood. A grip like that works by exploiting the shoulder joint's lack of leverage from behind. Nobody can generate power against a grab they never saw start. For about 0.4 of a second, Bruce Lee, a man who had, by then, spent 2 decades building a body that answered movement with movement, is simply along for the ride of somebody else's decision. Reaction. His feet replant. That's it. That's the whole visible response. And it's the one every witness who was close enough to see his face mentions first. Not fear, not anger, a kind of instant, total stillness. The stillness of a man recalculating in real time exactly how much of what happens next he's going to allow to happen. His head does turn fast toward the hand. Nobody who was there agrees on what his face was doing when he saw whose hand it was. Observation. And I want to pass this one along the way it was passed to me, because it's not mine to tell as if I saw it myself. One man who says he was standing in the wings that night put it to me this way. I've worked that stage 11 years. I've seen fights nearly break out over a missed light cue. That wasn't anger up there. That was a man doing math about how many ways this could end, standing completely still while he did it. I can't verify that quote belongs to a real person anyone could go find and ask. I'm telling you honestly, I can't. But it's the line that survives every telling of this story I've ever heard, word for word. And there's a reason for that. It's the only detail in the whole account that isn't about the bodyguard or the star or the tape. It's the only detail about Bruce. Widen the shot for a second, because the room around those 2 men was doing something worth noticing too. 400 people, packed into folding chairs under lights hot enough to make the whole front section sweat through their collars. And for that first half second after the hand lands, almost none of them register what they're looking at. A live audience trained on laugh cues and applause signs doesn't know how to read stillness. Somewhere in the 3rd row, a woman's compact mirror stays open in her hand, forgotten mid-check. A man near the aisle, who'd been reaching for his cigarettes the entire segment, leaves the pack half out of his jacket pocket. The band, off to one side, keeps its instruments raised and ready for a cue that never comes, because nobody in that room, not the band, not the crew, not the 400 paying witnesses, has a category yet for what a real grip looks like next to a rehearsed one. It takes the room almost a full second longer than it took Bruce to understand that something had actually changed. That gap, the one between a body understanding danger and a room understanding it, is where legends like this one live. Bruce knew in 0.4 of a second. The audience took most of a full second longer, and by the time the first gasp actually reaches the back rows, the moment is already over. And then the camera jerks, and the sound cuts, and a network engineer punches to commercial, and roughly 400 people sit in a hot room, staring at the same 14 seconds of car dealership footage they've already seen twice tonight, waiting for a show to come back that, when it does come back, picks up in a completely different place, the host alone at his desk, apologizing for technical difficulties, moving briskly to the next guest as if nothing at all had just happened 8 feet from where he's sitting. Behind that curtain, in the 90 seconds the home audience spend watching a car dealership commercial for the second time that night, the actual scramble looks nothing like the smooth recovery it sounds like from the outside. A floor manager, headset half torn from one ear, is waving both arms at a stage left door, mouthing something at a production assistant nobody can hear over the studio's own ventilation system. 2 stagehands move Bruce. Carefully, a hand at each elbow, not quite escorting and not quite restraining. Off the main set and behind a lighting rig, and by every account of the handful of crew members close enough to see his face, he doesn't fight the guidance at all. He walks where he's steered, calm, upright, a man who has clearly already decided that whatever happens next, it isn't going to happen with his own hands. The bodyguard, for his part, simply steps back into the same patch of shadow he came from, as if the 8 feet he just crossed had never been crossed at all. Nobody stops him. Nobody asks him a single question that night. The movie star, to his credit, breaks formation before anyone tells him to. He crosses to where Bruce is standing, says something short, puts a hand briefly on Bruce's shoulder, the second hand to land there in under a minute, though nobody in that moment seems to notice the echo, and by the time the studio floor manager gets back to center stage to reset the room, the two of them are talking quietly enough that not even the boom operator, standing 4 feet away, can make out the words. Here's what gets me about that transition every time I walk through it. Whatever happened on that stage in the 40 seconds the home audience never saw, somebody in that control room made a decision fast enough and clean enough that the show simply continued. That's not luck. That's a network that has done this before. And it had. This part isn't legend. This part is just how the television business worked in 1971. Live variety broadcasts of that era were routinely recorded onto 2-inch videotape reels that cost real money and got reused week after week, wiped and recorded over, because nobody at the time thought a Tuesday night novelty segment was worth the cost of a reel of its own. Whole broadcasts from that decade are gone for exactly this reason. Not conspiracy, just economics, a studio's accounting department deciding that history wasn't worth $1,100 a reel. That's real. That's not the myth doing its work. That's just what tape was back then. And it's the reason this story is even possible to tell honestly instead of as some sealed vault conspiracy. What isn't ordinary is how fast that particular reel found its way back into the rotation. 2 days by the account I trust most. Most disputed segments at that network, according to a retired engineer who worked there through the mid-70s and who I have no way of independently confirming ever actually said any of this to anyone, sat in a review closet for weeks before anybody decided what to do with them. This one didn't sit for an hour. A few days later, in a windowless office 2 floors above that same soundstage, for people watched the surviving footage, everything up to the cut, none of what came after, on a monitor too small for the room. Nobody who's ever described that meeting to me agrees on all 4 names. But the shape of the room never changes in the telling. A network vice president in shirt sleeves, tie already loosened by 10 in the morning. The head of standards and practices, a notepad balanced on one knee, the kind of man whose entire job is deciding what a paying public is and isn't allowed to see. A publicist assigned to the movie star's picture, there to protect one client and one client only. And a 4th chair, always described a little differently depending on who's telling it. Sometimes a lawyer, sometimes an accountant, sometimes simply a man from upstairs whose actual title nobody in the room that day apparently thought to ask. They watched the 6 minutes twice. The second time, by the account that's reached me most consistently, nobody says a word until it ends. And here's the part of this story I'm not going to soften for you, because the legend doesn't get to only be about what was done to Bruce. It has to also be honest about what Bruce did. Watch that surviving footage. The part that exists, the part anyone with the right connections at that network could, in theory, still find. And it shows a man who is, in that specific 6 minutes, more than a little pleased with himself. He corrects the host's introduction on air twice with a small smile that plays better in person than it does on tape. When the star fumbles his blocking on the second take of rehearsal, reported, not on the broadcast tape itself, Bruce says, loud enough for the crew to hear, something close to some men take a little longer to find their feet, and doesn't quite manage to make it sound like he's only talking about balance. It isn't cruelty. Nobody who was there describes it as cruelty. But it isn't humility either. Watched cold, without already knowing how the story ends, it plays a little ugly. There's a version of Bruce Lee that television audiences got exactly 6 minutes of that Tuesday night, and that version is sharp-tongued, faintly superior, entirely aware of exactly how good he is next to the man he's sharing a stage with, and not especially interested in hiding it. I bring this up because it would be easy, telling this story, to make Bruce the pure victim of the next 90 minutes and the network the pure villain. And that's not actually what the surviving tape shows. What the surviving tape shows is a 30-year-old man who has just watched a television career get quietly taken away from him, walking onto a stage with something to prove and proving it in a way that reads, honestly, a little ugly. That's not the myth doing its work. That's just a man having a bad night in front of the wrong audience. It matters, this detail, because of what the four people in that windowless office decide to do with it. They don't decide the segment is dangerous. They decide it's embarrassing, and not in the direction anyone would expect. Embarrassing to the star, obviously, whose manager has already called twice that morning. But embarrassing, too, to the network itself for having put a guest on live television who came across, in the head of Standard's own note scrawled at the bottom of a review sheet that a production assistant would later describe to more than one person, as a bit much. A guest who made the biggest name on the call sheet look slow, and then let the room see that he knew it. So the decision isn't really about protecting Bruce, and it isn't purely about protecting the star. It's about protecting the broadcast, smoothing over 40 seconds that make everybody involved look bad for a different reason, and doing it the easiest way available to a network in 1971, which is to simply let a reel get wiped like 100 reels before it, and call it a technical loss. 2 weeks pass before anyone outside that building hears a word about any of it. What finally gets out isn't the truth. It's a rumor, and it's the wrong rumor. And that's almost funnier than if nobody had heard anything at all. An entertainment trade paper runs 4 sentences, buried on page 11, about technical difficulties during Tuesday's broadcast. No names beyond the movie stars. No detail beyond a vague mention of an altercation involving a guest. For sentences is nothing. For sentences, in a town built entirely on gossip, is a match dropped in dry grass. By the following week, the version circulating in certain rooms, martial arts schools, mostly the exact back rooms this story lives in to this day, has the sequence backward. Some people, hearing only that something physical happened and that the home audience saw a camera jerk before losing sound entirely, decide that Bruce Lee grabbed the movie star, not the other way around. Nobody who tells it that way saw the actual footage. Nobody who tells it that way seems to think that matters. Now, here's what gets me about that particular twist of the story, and I think about it more than almost anything else in this whole account. A man gets physically seized on live television, in front of his own audience, by another man's hired muscle, and within 2 weeks, the rumor mill has quietly recast him as the aggressor. That's not an accident of gossip. That's what happens again and again when the person with less institutional power is standing next to the person with more of it, and something goes wrong in public. The story doesn't sort itself by what happened. It sorts itself by who has more to lose if it's told correctly. Bruce hears the wrong version too, eventually, from more than one source, and by every account of that week, he doesn't correct it loudly. He doesn't call the trade paper. He doesn't phone the movie star's people demanding a retraction. He goes quiet, works his students a little harder than usual that week, and says almost nothing about it to anyone outside his own house. Inside his own house is a different matter. His wife, watching him come home 3 nights running saying almost nothing and eating almost nothing, is the one who finally gets him to say the thing out loud that's actually eating at him. And it isn't the bodyguard, and it isn't the missing tape. It's the 6 minutes before any of that happened. The version of himself he watched once on a kinescope a friend at the station quietly let him see. Sharp-tongued, a little superior, enjoying himself at another man's expense in front of 400 strangers on the one night in months when he'd finally been handed real airtime, real proof that an audience wanted him. He knew, watching it back, that the four executives in that windowless office weren't entirely wrong about him. That's a harder thing to sit with than being wronged. Being wronged, a man can be angry about cleanly. Being partly right and partly out of line, at the same time, in front of the exact audience he needed to win over, that just sits in a man's chest for a while with nowhere to go. That's the myth doing its work, if you want to call it that, except this time it's working against him instead of for him. 11 days after the broadcast, a letter arrives, and the letter is the thing that actually starts the second half of this story. It comes on the network's own letterhead from an office that signs itself business affairs, and it is, in its own way, a small masterpiece of institutional nerve. The letter does not mention a bodyguard. It does not mention a grip, a shoulder, a jerking camera, or 40 missing seconds of anything. What it mentions in careful, bloodless paragraphs is the disruption to the broadcast schedule of Tuesday's program. Dead air in the network's own internal accounting, running to just over 90 seconds once the scramble to fill it gets counted. 2 advertiser placements that, per the letter, will require make-good consideration at the network's expense, and a technical review. The letter notes that has identified the disruption as originating from an unscripted physical incident involving a guest performer. A guest performer. Him, not the bodyguard. Not the man who signaled the bodyguard. Him. The number at the bottom of the second page is $11,400, and the letter is careful, almost polite, about how it arrived at that figure, and equally careful never to explain who exactly is meant to have caused the incident it's billing him for. Now, I want to put that number somewhere it can actually be felt, because $11,400 sitting on a page means nothing without the man attached to it. Bruce Lee, in the spring of 1971, is not yet the Bruce Lee whose name alone could absorb a bill like that without blinking. He is a working martial arts instructor with a small stable of private students, a stalled television career, a wife, 2 young children, and a bank balance that, by every account from people who actually saw his books around that time, would have made that number a genuinely frightening one to see attached to his own name. His manager reads the letter twice and says the same 4 words both times. They know he won't fight this in court. That's not paranoia. That's just an accurate read of the room. A television network in 1971 has lawyers on permanent retainer, an in-house press office, and the kind of institutional patience that can outlast almost anyone with a mortgage and a family. A 30-year-old martial arts instructor with a stalled pilot has none of that. He has, if he's being honest with himself, exactly one asset that matters here, and it's the same asset that got him onto that stage in the first place. Reputation the industry is still deciding whether it wants. A lawyer, a friend of a friend, meets Bruce in a diner 2 blocks from his own studio rather than an office, because Bruce, by every account, doesn't want to be seen walking into a lawyer's office that week. The lawyer reads the letter over eggs going cold and says the thing that every account of this story agrees he said, word for word, because it's the kind of line that just sticks. This isn't really a bill. It's a question. They want to know how much noise he's planning on making. The diner itself is the kind of place that exists in every city that has a television studio in it. A counter of cracked red vinyl stools. A waitress who's worked the graveyard shift long enough to stop asking questions about the men who come in at odd hours not eating what they ordered, a radio behind the counter playing something nobody's listening to. Bruce sits with his back to the wall, a habit his students would recognize instantly, and nobody else in that diner would ever notice. He doesn't raise his voice once. He asks 2 questions. What happens if he simply doesn't answer the letter at all? And what happens if he answers it and says no, and the lawyer answers both honestly, which is worse, in its way, than if he'd lied? Ignoring it changes nothing, the lawyer tells him, except that eventually it becomes a lawsuit, And a lawsuit is a war of attrition between people who can afford to lose slowly and people who can't. Saying no outright. The lawyer pauses here, by every account, longer than the question deserves. Saying no outright means never working for that network or anyone who owes that network a favor again. Bruce doesn't order anything else. He leaves half his coffee cold on the counter, pays for both meals before the lawyer can reach for his wallet, and walks the 2 blocks back to his own studio in silence. And there, right there, is the actual shape of the dilemma this story turns on. Not a fight Bruce can win or lose with his hands, because there's nobody left in this to hit. Pay a sum he genuinely cannot spare, and let the whole thing quietly end. Or refuse, and find out exactly how much an aggrieved network can make a small martial arts instructor's life difficult. One canceled booking at a time, in a town where nobody ever tells a man why the phone stopped ringing. Bruce Lee, 30 years old, staring at eggs he hasn't touched, is not thinking about a bodyguard's hand on his shoulder anymore. He's thinking about rent. Flip it around for a second, because 2 blocks from that diner, an entirely different phone starts ringing, and it belongs to the one man in this whole story who never actually did anything wrong. The movie star hears about the letter almost by accident. A crew member who liked Bruce, talking too freely at a party, mentions the number out loud in front of the wrong person, and within a day, it's back to the star himself. And here's the thing about him that every account agrees on, the thing that makes him, if nothing else, the one genuinely decent figure in this whole account. He's furious. Not performed furious. Actually furious. In a specific way, famous men get furious when they realize somebody used their name to make somebody else's life harder without ever once asking them. He does the thing his manager begged him, for 11 days, not to do. He talks, on the record, to an entertainment reporter covering the press round for his own picture. He brings it up himself, unprompted, and says, and this line does get repeated accurately because reporters kept notes and the notes survive, that Bruce Lee did absolutely nothing on that stage that deserves a bill, and that whatever happened that night was somebody's overreaction, not his. The room where he says it isn't glamorous. A hotel conference space rented by the hour, folding chairs, a table skirted in the same beige felt every studio uses for these things, a handful of reporters more interested in lunch than in whatever picture he's actually there to promote. He isn't asked about Bruce Lee. That's the detail worth sitting with. Nobody in that room brings the name up. He brings it up himself, unprompted, in the middle of a question about something else entirely. And for a second or two, the reporters in the front row simply stop writing, because a leading man volunteering an opinion nobody asked for is, in its own small way, more interesting than anything on his press notes. A photographer near the back gets one frame of his manager's face at the exact moment the sentence lands, jaw tight, eyes on the exit. And that photograph, more than the quote itself, is the one people who are in that room still bring up decades later. It's a good thing to say. It's a decent, generous, entirely sincere thing for a famous man to say on the record about someone with far less power than him. And if this were a simpler story, that would be the end of it. The star's word clears Bruce's name. The network quietly drops its letter. Everybody moves on. Here's what actually happens instead. The quote runs, and because it's a real box office name defending someone, rather than 4 sentences buried on page 11, it doesn't stay buried. 3 more papers pick it up inside a week, then a wire service, and suddenly the story isn't a rumor in martial arts backrooms anymore. It's a real, named, dated item in the entertainment press, complete with the detail everyone had managed to keep quiet until now. A martial artist got physically grabbed on the star's own live broadcast, and the network is billing him for it. That's the story the network spent 2 weeks and a wiped reel of tape trying to make sure never got told, and a famous man's good intentions just told it to 500,000 readers. Add fear to that network's equation now, because a private, quiet arrangement they could have closed with a letter and a signature just became a public liability with the star's own name attached to it. The network's lawyers, who had been content to let the $11,000 letter sit and do its slow work, now want the whole matter closed, fast, quiet, and airtight. Because a public story about a network billing a guest for an incident a famous star just publicly called somebody's overreaction is a story that makes the network look considerably worse than a wiped reel of tape ever could. And Bruce, who should by any fair accounting be relieved that someone with real power just spoke up for him, find himself in a strange, uncomfortable new position instead. He is, as of that week, publicly known throughout the industry not as the man who handled himself with total control in front of 400 people. He's known as the man a movie star had to go to bat for. In a business built entirely on the appearance of who needs protecting and who doesn't, that's not nothing. That's a debt, whether he asked for it or not. And debts in this town get collected in ways that have nothing to do with money. The manager in the gray suit, watching his own client hand the story new legs on the evening news, does not forgive Bruce for any of it. If anything, the association only sharpens whatever the manager already decided about him 3 weeks earlier in a rehearsal hall, watching 400 strangers laugh at the wrong man. Now factor in the reputation on the line for everyone in this story at once, because that's the stage the next 2 weeks actually play out on. 4 days of silence follow the Wire story. No new letter, no phone call from Business Affairs, no word from the star, who has said his piece and by every account considers the matter closed, and honorably so. Just silence. Bruce's manager tells him silence is good news. Bruce, who has learned by now to read a room the hard way, isn't so sure. He keeps teaching his private students through those 4 days. By every account, he's sharper with them than usual, more exacting, the kind of instructor who corrects a stance twice when once would do. And he keeps waiting for the second letter, because a network that moves a bad tape out of rotation in 2 days instead of 2 weeks is not a network that goes quiet by accident. On the 5th day, 2 things happen within an hour of each other, and it's worth laying them side by side, because that's the actual shape of the pressure this story turns on. The first is small. A booking Bruce had been promised, a demonstration slot at an industry function, nothing glamorous but real, paying work in front of the kind of people who hire martial arts consultants for pictures. Gets a call from the organizers. Scheduling conflict, they say. Maybe next year. Nobody says the word network. Nobody says the word blacklist. Bruce's manager, hanging up that phone, doesn't need either word said out loud to understand exactly what just happened. The second is a meeting request, delivered by messenger rather than mail this time, for 2 o'clock the following afternoon, at a law office rather than a diner. The subject line, typed by a secretary with no idea what she's actually typing, reads, resolution. That's the word they use. Resolution. As if there's something broken between 2 equal parties that simply needs mending, rather than one party holding every card and the other one holding a stalled pilot, a lawyer he's borrowing goodwill to afford, and a growing list of bookings that keep discovering scheduling conflicts. The document itself, when Bruce's lawyer finally gets to read it that morning before the meeting, is 4 pages, and every one of the 4 pages is built around a single sentence that gets restated 5 different ways in 5 different paragraphs. That no wrongdoing occurred on the part of the network, its personnel, or any performer or representative associated with the broadcast in question. And that Bruce, in exchange for the network's agreement not to pursue its claim for the costs of the disrupted broadcast, releases all parties from any claim whatsoever, now or in the future, arising from the events of that Tuesday night. Nothing happened. That's the actual content of the document, boiled down to its real meaning underneath the legal paragraphs. Sign here, and the official version of that Tuesday night becomes, nothing happened. Not to him. Not because of him. Nothing. His lawyer reads it twice at the diner table, the same diner as before, and says the only honest thing there is to say about a document like that. This isn't a settlement. It's an erasure. And once that's signed, the man that hand landed on stops existing on paper. What's left is a man who agreed it never landed at all. That night, at home, Bruce doesn't talk about the document until his kids are asleep, and even then he doesn't talk about it the way pride is supposed to sound when it's just been wounded. He talks about arithmetic, same word his manager used, weeks earlier, without either of them realizing they'd land on the same one. Here's the arithmetic, laid out the way he laid it out that night, according to the one person who was actually in that kitchen with him. On one side, his name, cleared in the only court that would ever actually hear the case. A court that doesn't exist, made up of martial artists and crew members and a handful of newspaper readers who'd already half decided the story wrong before he could correct it. A moral victory nobody official would ever record. Possibly, if he fought in the press the way the Star had fought it for him, a longer, uglier public fight that would make him more famous for being grabbed on television than for anything he'd ever actually built with his own hands. On the other side, $11,400 he does not have. A career that depends entirely on producers and networks who do not need a reason to stop returning his calls. They only need an excuse, and a signature that says nothing happened is the cheapest excuse in the world to not need. 2 children who are too young to understand any of this, and a wife who has watched him build a career one closed door at a time for a decade already, brick by brick, without a single institution ever handing him anything he didn't first have to prove he deserved twice. And underneath both columns, sitting there the whole time, the thing he can't quite say out loud, even in his own kitchen. That's 6 minutes of surviving footage. The version of himself that 4 network executives had called a bit much, and hadn't been entirely wrong to call it. If he turns this into a public fight, that footage doesn't stay buried either. He gets to be the wrong man on the 11 o'clock news, sure, but he also gets to be, forever, the man who was condescending to a movie star on live television the same night he got manhandled for it. Both halves of that Tuesday night come out together, or neither one does. Here's what gets me most about this part of the legend. More than the hand, more than the tape. He wasn't just weighing money against pride. He was weighing the version of the story where he's simply the victim against the version where he's a complicated man having a bad, human, imperfect night, and he understood, with a clarity that most 30-year-olds fighting for their careers never get handed, that only one of those 2 versions was actually true, and it wasn't the flattering one. He decides that night, in that kitchen, with his wife's hand on his arm and both children finally quiet down the hall. Nobody outside that room hears what was actually said. Every version of this story that's ever reached me has agreed on the outcome and disagreed completely on the words. And I'm not going to pretend I know which telling is real. I don't. But every version agrees on what happened the next afternoon. 2 o'clock. The law office, not the diner. A conference table too large for the 4 people sitting at it. A network lawyer who has done this exact thing enough times that his pen is already uncapped before Bruce sits down. Bruce Lee reads all 4 pages himself, slowly, out loud in his own head, his lawyer watching his face for some sign of what he's about to do. He gets to the last paragraph, the one that states, in the flattest language 4 pages of careful writing can produce, that nothing happened, and he stops there longer than anywhere else on the page. Then he picks up the pen. I want to slow down on this part because it's the part the legend actually exists to protect, and it deserves better than a rush sentence. These are hands that, 11 days earlier, closed around a man's wrist before the man's own fist finished traveling 6 inches. Hands that a windowless office full of network executives had already decided, on tape, were a little too pleased with themselves. And now those same hands are doing the smallest, least dramatic thing they will do in this entire story. For small motions. BR. Ukorsui. A surname after it. No flerisk. His lawyer, watching, will say for years afterward that he'd expected something. A pause, a muttered word, some visible cost paid at the moment of signing. And there wasn't one. The signature took, by the lawyer's own estimate, under 4 seconds. That's the whole climax of this story, if this story needs one. 4 seconds. Not a punch. Not a comeback. A man signing his own name to a sentence that says none of this happened, in a room with beige walls and a coffee pot nobody's touched, while a network lawyer recaps his pen and slides the document into a folder before the ink's even fully dry. Now, did it happen exactly like that? For pages, a diner, a kitchen conversation nobody recorded, a signature in under 4 seconds? Almost certainly not with this precision. I wasn't in that room. Nobody who's ever told me this story was in that room. But every version I've collected, and I've collected more than I can count at this point, agrees on the shape of it, even when the details drift. A document existed, it said nothing happened, and Bruce Lee signed it. And here's the part one keep coming back to. The reason I don't think this is a story about a man being beaten. He didn't sign that document because he was afraid of the network. He signed it because he did the math on what fighting it would actually cost the people who depended on him. And he decided that his own bruised pride wasn't worth more than his family's next year of rent, or the next producer's phone call, or the next audience that might finally give him what that stalled pilot never did. That's not surrender. That's a man choosing, with his eyes open, exactly which battle is actually worth his name. He didn't need 4 pages of legal paper to tell him what happened on that stage. He knew. His wife knew. The handful of people close enough to that curtain to see it knew. The document doesn't erase the Tuesday night. It just erases the network's exposure to it, which, given enough thought, was never really his to protect in the first place. He walks out of that office, by every account, exactly the way he walked in. No visible anger. No visible relief. A man who has just done something quietly expensive and doesn't intend to let the room see the bill. That's the theory of how this ends. Here's what the practice actually looked like in the weeks after. The movie star and Bruce cross paths exactly once more that year, an industry function neither of them handles quite the same way twice. By most accounts, it's warm. Genuinely warm. The star, true to form, goes out his way to shake Bruce's hand in front of enough people that the gesture reads as intentional, and says something short and decent that nobody quite agrees on the wording of. But it's also, by every account, brief. Whatever might have grown between two men who'd shared a stage in a strange, ugly footnote of a night never really gets the chance to become friendship. There's too much unspoken sitting between them. The manager, the bill, the document neither of them ever discusses out loud. And both men, being professionals in a business built on managing exactly this kind of unspoken weight, simply let stay unspoken. The manager in the gray suit keeps his job, keeps his client. As far as anyone I've ever spoken to knows, he is never once asked by anyone with the authority to make him answer whether he gave any kind of signal that Tuesday night to a bodyguard who was never his own employee to command. That thread, who told that man to cross 8 feet of soundstage floor, and why, simply stops. Nobody official ever pulls on it again. It's one of the strange privileges of institutional power that this story keeps demonstrating. The people positioned closest to a decision are so rarely the ones left holding its cost. The network, for its part, moves on the way networks always move on, completely, instantly, as if the previous Tuesday never happened at all, because as far as its own paperwork is concerned, it didn't. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, 4 pages sit that say so, signed in under 4 seconds by a hand that had, 11 days earlier, stopped a fist from finishing its swing. Here's what I think is worth sitting with. though, before we close this one out, because this isn't actually the last time a piece of the entertainment machine find a use for Bruce Lee, gets what it needs from him, and then quietly decides he's more useful managed than championed. That happens again, more than once. I'm not going to tell that story tonight. It belongs to a different night, a different studio, a different set of hands deciding what gets kept and what gets wiped. But I want you to remember this one when we get there, because it's the first time, as far as I've ever been able to trace it, that the pattern shows itself clearly enough to name. A system that uses a man's gifts first and only afterward decides whether it can also stomach the man attached to them. That's not a moral. That's just an observation, and I think it's the truer of the two. Years pass before Bruce Lee gets anywhere near the kind of leverage that would have let him tear up a document like that one instead of signing it. The kind of fame where a network needs him more than he needs a network, where a bill for $11,400 would have been paid without a second thought, or more likely, never sent at all. By the time that leverage arrives, this particular Tuesday night is old news, filed away, unmentioned in every interview he ever gives about how he got where he was going. He never talks about it publicly. Not once, in any interview I've ever tracked down, does he mention a bodyguard, a bill, or a document. Whether that's because he genuinely let it go, or because letting it go was the last part of the arithmetic he'd already worked out at that kitchen table, I don't know. I don't think anyone does. There's one more thing worth circling back to, though, before we close this out, a detail almost nobody includes when they tell this story, because it doesn't have a bodyguard in it or a network lawyer in it, and people telling a story tend to cut the parts without villains. During those 4 days of silence, before the meeting request and the messenger and the 4 pages waiting to be read, Bruce trained. Same hours as always. Same small room above the same herbalist shop his students remember for the rest of their lives. Same worn patch of floor. But by the account of one student who was there, a teenager at the time, an old man now, the kind of old man who still remembers exactly what an evening felt like 50 years later, Bruce spent almost the entire session that week on a single drill. Not a strike, not a form, a release. Over and over, he had a student grip his wrist, hard, both hands, full strength, the kind of grip that's supposed to be inescapable if it's done right. And over, Bruce simply relaxed the arm rather than fighting the grip directly, let his structure go soft at exactly the point of contact, and stepped through the space the other man's own effort had opened up. No force against force. No test of strength he could lose. Just economy, patience, and a complete refusal to meet somebody else's grip with anything that grip could actually hold on to. He didn't say much while he drilled it. The student remembers him saying one thing near the end of that week that he's repeated to more people over the decades than he can count, because it's the kind of line that explains a man better than a biography could. The hand only controls you if you fight it on its own terms. I don't know if he was thinking about a soundstage in that room. I don't know if he was thinking about anything at all beyond the drill itself. Sometimes a man just trains because it's Tuesday and training is what he does on a Tuesday. But I've never been able to unhear that line since I first heard it, and I don't think it's easy to unhear, not after tonight. Here's what gets me about it, and then I promise we'll finish this one honestly. A hand had already controlled him once, completely, for 0.4 of a second, on live television, in front of 400 strangers and however many more home. He couldn't undo that. Nobody can undo a hand that's already landed. But a week later, alone in a small room with bad lighting, he was already working out how never to be controlled by one again. Not through force, not through revenge, but through exactly the kind of soft, patient release that got him nothing on the news, no headline, no vindication, and everything that actually mattered to the only version of himself he had to keep living with. That's the man underneath the legend, if this story has one worth finding. Not the 6 minutes of sharp-tongued television. Not the 4 seconds it took to sign his name. The one working out, alone, on a Tuesday nobody was filming, how to make sure it never happened to him again. Now, back to the 40 seconds, because I've been circling them all night, and I owe you an honest answer to the only question that actually brought us here. What was on that tape? Here's the trouble, and I want to be completely straight about the shape of it. Every version of this story I've ever been told has its own answer, and every single one of those answers contradicts at least one other answer just as confidently. One version, the one I've heard most often, usually from people who never met anyone who was actually in that studio, says the missing footage shows Bruce Lee taking the bodyguard apart in about 6 seconds, calmly, without ever raising his voice, and that the network buried it because a guest embarrassing a professional bodyguard on live television was somehow worse for business than a guest simply getting manhandled. It's a satisfying version. In the telling, the bodyguard ends up on the studio floor, jacket torn at one shoulder seam, and the 400 people in the room go so quiet that somebody's dropped compact mirror is, again, the loudest sound anyone remembers. It's the version that hands over the ending everyone came here wanting. I have never once found a single piece of it that holds up past the second question. Another version, quieter, less flattering, told mostly by people who lean toward the idea that Bruce Lee the man deserves more respect than Bruce Lee the myth, says almost the opposite. That he did nothing at all in those 40 seconds. That he simply stood there, hands still gripping his shoulder, and let it happen because starting a real fight on live television with a man 3 times his mass, in front of a paying audience and an actor's whole career riding on the broadcast, was never once worth the cost, no matter how badly his own instincts wanted otherwise. In this version, there's no torn jacket, no dramatic reversal, just a hand staying exactly where it landed for the better part of a minute, and a room full of people slowly realizing that the stillness in front of them isn't weakness, and isn't quite triumph either. In this version, the 40 seconds don't show restraint as spectacle. They show restraint as something closer to grief. A third version, which I trust the least and can't quite let go of anyway, has the movie star himself stepping between them before any of it could go further. His own hand, not Bruce's, breaking the bodyguard's grip, an act of decency the network had every reason to bury because it made their own hired muscle look foolish on television, protecting a guest their own security had just assaulted. In this telling, the two of them shake hands once the cameras are supposed to be rolling again, and nobody watching from the seats ever gets to see it. I cannot tell you which of these, if any, is real. Nobody I have ever spoken to about this story can either, and I'd rather be honest about that than pick the version that makes for the best ending, because that's exactly the trap this whole genre keeps setting for storytellers like me. There is no surviving copy. No engineer has ever come forward with a reel he kept against orders. No lawsuit ever forced a deposition that would have put the true sequence of those 40 seconds on the record, because Bruce Lee signed 4 pages that made sure no lawsuit ever could. Every witness who might once have settled this argument has, by now, either passed on or simply never talked. And the ones who did talk over the years, in bars and back rooms and dojos exactly like the ones this story comes from, never once agreed with each other closely enough to count as a record instead of a rumor. That's not a loose thread I'm choosing to leave hanging for effect. That's just where the evidence actually runs out. Take a step back for a second, because I think the not knowing is actually why this particular story has outlived 100 flashier ones. There are dozens of legends about Bruce Lee where the ending is clean, where he dismantles somebody in 90 seconds and the room falls silent, and everybody agrees on exactly what they saw and why it mattered. Those stories are satisfying in a simple way, and I've told a few of them myself other nights. But they're also, if I'm honest, a little like fables. They resolve. They hand over a moral on the way out the door, gift wrapped, and the audience gets to feel good about a man they never met winning a fight they never saw. This one doesn't do that, and I think that's exactly why it survived. Nobody telling this story gets to end it with a clean win. The 40 seconds stay 40 seconds. The document stays signed. The bodyguard employer stays unnamed. Every single person who's ever told me this story, across every version I collected, ends it the same uneasy way. Not with a punchline, but with a kind of shrug, because the not knowing is the only part of the story that's actually honest. Here's what I think that says about us, and I'll be quick about it, because there's a promise of no lectures tonight. We don't keep telling this one, because we want to know what was on that tape. If we wanted resolution, we'd have stopped telling it decades ago, the way a joke gets dropped once nobody laughs at it anymore. We keep telling it because the not knowing does something a resolved story can't. It leaves room for a man to be complicated, sharp-tongued, and superior for 6 real minutes, wronged and helpless for 4/10 of a second, calculating and unheroic at a kitchen table, and quietly, privately disciplined about it in a room with bad lighting a week later, all without ever handing down a verdict on which version of him was the true one. Maybe all of them were. That's usually how it goes with people who aren't characters in a story, which before he became one, he wasn't. So let's close this one out honestly, the way it was promised at the start. There are 40 seconds of tape that don't exist anymore, and that's still true. I don't know what was on them. Nobody does. 3 competing legends got told tonight about what happened in that gap. And here's the honest truth about all 3. None of them were invented for this telling. But there's no 4th version to offer up as the real one, because it doesn't exist, and neither does anyone who's ever actually seen it. I don't know. That's the most honest sentence in this entire hour and a half. And it matters more to me than a tidy ending that was never mine to give. Here's what I do know, or at least what I've come to believe after collecting every version of this story I could find. A hand landed on a man's shoulder on live television in 1971, and whatever happened the 40 seconds after that, it cost that man $11,400 he didn't have, a document that says none of it happened, and a small, private piece of the freedom to ever say otherwise. He signed it anyway, not because he was weak, but because he did the arithmetic on what his name was actually worth to protect and decided a signature was a smaller price than everything riding on the other side of it. And then, on his own time, in a room nobody was filming, he went back to work on the only part of that Tuesday night he still had the power to change, not what had already been done to him, but what would be possible to do to him next. This is a legend, a story I tell, dramatized and largely imagined, inspired by the real Bruce Lee, not a record of him. The network, the movie star, the manager, the bodyguard, the letter, the document, the 40 missing seconds. None of it comes with a surviving signature or a reel anyone can still play. But the man underneath all of it, the one who could do the math on his own dignity and shoes, with his eyes open, exactly which fight was worth having. That part, I believe, is real. And I think that's the part worth keeping, tape or no tape. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do. Until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.